Afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Schaffer from CIWEM. I will be going through some housekeeping, but I just wanted to welcome you to this BeFloodReady webinar on innovation and flood resilience. I will just briefly go through some of the key elements of this. I don't think there'll be any surprises to you. We're recording this session. This will be available on the CIWEM YouTube channel once we've got the necessary permissions from everybody. And if you experience any technical issues and need any assistance, please do use the chat feature, and Barbara will do what she can in the background to help you. In terms of questions, please use the Q&A function and for the presentations. And please also use the Q&A facility to upvote any questions you would like us to prioritize when we get to the Q&A session at the end. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Richard from the Environment Agency, who's our chair for this afternoon.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Richard Taylor. I'm a flood risk senior advisor at the Environment Agency, and I specialise in property flood resilience. I'm also a member of the project steering group for BeFloodReady, so this CIWEM community of practice for PFR. So I'm very grateful to be chairing this and to welcome you to this BeFloodReady webinar on innovation and flood resilience. And it's really great to have you all with us here today. For those of you who might be quite new to PFR, it's an approach that's used to reduce damages and disruption caused by flooding at the property level, with the intention of ensuring people don't have to move out of their home or business for a very long, extended period of time. So this community of practice, badged under the BeFloodReady banner, provides a national platform for professionals who are both delivering but also interested in PFR. And Paul will give you a few more details about the community of practice later, but its primary purpose is to provide a platform to share updates and good practice and really provide that safe space for peer-to-peer learning. This event today and all the activities of CIWEM's BeFloodReady initiative wouldn't be possible without the kind support of the partners and supporters, as you can see in the slide that's on screen at the moment. PFR is a relatively new approach to managing flood risk and increasing the resilience of people, properties and broader communities. So as such, it's constantly evolving and innovating, and innovation can come in many forms. This webinar in particular will focus on innovation related to processes, to people and to products, like information and flood risk measures to improve resistance and resilience. As we heard from the last BeFloodReady webinar, which was held back in April, PFR is really dependent on interaction with people. There's lots of innovation and approaches to how we can raise awareness and engage with people on their resilience and help support behaviours that empower people to become more prepared and more resilient for flooding. And that really helps with the recovery side when flooding does happen. Since 2021, innovation in flood risk management has been given a massive boost with the introduction of the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme, or FCRIP, which is part of the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy for England. Now, this programme is funded by DEFRA and managed by ourselves at the Environment Agency, and includes 25 projects which are looking to address current and future risks with a focus on learning from doing. And much of the work that you'll hear about today is supported by that programme. So this afternoon is your opportunity to hear from some great speakers and those involved in innovation in flood resilience, and more specifically in property flood resilience, or PFR, offering different perspectives on some of the challenges and the benefits that we can achieve through good delivery of PFR. So what we'll do is we'll hear from all of the presenters, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion at the end of all the presentations. We're scheduled to finish at 4 o'clock. So in order to make sure that we get through all these great presentations and give them the most amount of time possible, we'll, without further ado, we'll move on and start them in earnest. So Jonathan Cassian from FloodReady is our first presenter. I'm delighted to have Jonathan here with us, and he's going to talk about supporting innovation and research in flood resilience. So Jonathan's head of research at FloodReady. He leads their work to measure and incentivize resilience. So working with industry and government, his focus is on developing an actionable evidence base for resilience and policies that reduce flood risk, and on nature-based solutions as well. So Jonathan's presentation will provide an overview of the PFR market and outline future plans to support innovation and research in flood resilience. And just a reminder, if you've got any questions, please use the Q&A function. If your questions for a specific presenter, please indicate as such. And also, please do vote for any questions that you'd be most interested in hearing a response on. And we'll pose questions to the presenters at the end of all the presentations. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Jonathan.
Great, thanks. And I guess someone else is, yeah, there we go. We can move on in the slides. What I'm going to cover today is really about the PFR sector, the folks who are out there delivering it, and then a couple, what I see as sort of the dual challenge. I'm here to speak on innovation, but I think it's the challenge is actually broader than that. The Transition Plan 2023, which is what FloodReady proposes to do about these things, and where we are, some of the things that are underway and upcoming. So next slide. So in terms of the PFR sector, we did a report which came out about a year and a half ago, and was the first time that there'd ever been kind of a survey of the folks who are out there delivering, making the products and putting them into people's homes. And we spoke with about 45 companies, 44 companies, and really what we found, so there's installers, there's manufacturers, and then there's sort of specialist divisions within larger companies. But in total, it came out to about 25 million maybe, which is tiny. So the big point about this, the big finding there is it's a really small sector. And the number of homes being done in a year is about 500, 600. And that was a year and a half ago, so things have shifted a little bit since then. Most of that was publicly supported. Very, very few people undertake this on their own. So basically, this is not a commercially, it's not a widespread commercial sector. If you think about the home building sector, it's hundreds of billions. This is 20 to 30 million. It's minuscule. So one of the key, well, I'll come to one of the key challenges. Next slide. So yeah, the market dynamics are that about 10 years ago, we really saw this being a door-to-door industry where you had the people, kind of cowboys as they're called, just delivering willy-nilly. And since then, there's been a lot of development, the code of practice, kite marking, certification, etc., to really move forward the quality assurance in the sector. And so the companies that do it are really focused on quality. At that time, there hadn't been really any major events. Last winter was interesting. We'll talk a bit about that. But this is an industry that also was sort of driven by those events. It would go through these booms and busts, up and down, depending on how much work there was, because if there wasn't flooding, there wasn't necessarily work. So that's been one of the challenges to overcome that. But we have seen sort of demand coming through in other areas, which I'll talk a little bit about. Next slide. So I'm here to talk about innovation, but as I said, I think there's actually a dual challenge, and that's about the size of the market, scaling. So what that study found is that there really are companies that, like, the products are there, that there is a door that can be designed for different applications. There's a huge amount of bespoke work. What is really required is scaling that, is taking those things and making them available to a wider range of homes at comparable timeframes, comparable costs to the rest. It's getting there, but ultimately some of the innovation is around consumer relationships, business models, etc. And ensuring diverse markets so that companies can survive through those boom and bust phases, and also from the public side, doing the things that are needed to create that. Either scaling up BBB, scaling up the EA schemes, and having consumers be aware of those things. Next slide. Getting rid of all the words on the slide. I apologize. I have some wordy slides. But basically, oh no, back. Hiding the words, so like the main point here is that there needs to be a big enough market to innovate into, and that innovation is required to build that market. So there need to be the appropriate kinds of products, and there's lots of different home types in the UK. So gradually moving towards that kind of full coverage is needed, but ultimately the demand has to be there to drive the innovation. So it needs to be this virtuous circle. It's not just about the innovation independently on its own. Now, next slide. But where those dual barriers in the past, so you can actually become the virtuous circle. We sometimes talk about chicken and egg issues. Well, if a lot of these things move forward together, you start to create these reinforcing cycles. So, standardization of products, but a more flexible standard than the current one that's in place. A little bit right now, it costs. It's fairly costly and time consuming to have products tested because a kite mark and kite marked, because a kite mark only applies to one product. So let's say a door opens to the left. It needs to go through a separate testing for one that goes through the right. So it's quite an onerous process for a lot of this stuff. So moving towards something that's more flexible is probably the long-term view, but at the same time, for now, having those standards, having that demonstration of quality is really important. But the schemes are gradually working to scale up demand. Nope, back. Could go back. Sorry. The scheme, so DEFRA, EA, BBB, everything is trying to increase its scope, scale, penetration, uptake in particular, getting more people to say yes to it, so that creates more and more demand, which can allow for a wider range of product offerings. And I'll come back when I talk about BBB to why this matters in terms of the products being comparable to those in the mass market. But part of it also is about being able to trial and test applications. So we're working towards increasing the number of facilities and entities involved in those that kind of innovation facilitation. The universities really have these functions. So whether it's Hull, Leeds has done some. There are facilities out there. It's just making sure the market's there to start doing more of this. And then right at the end there, we talk about the evidence base. So a lot of this is new. A lot of the techniques are new. They don't have the demonstrations and kind of proof point. Well, they have demonstrations, but they don't have standardized methodological data that shows exactly what it does. So as we move towards that, that'll start to inform A, best practice, and B, kind of homeowner and financial sector understanding of what is needed and what exists in homes to be able to protect those homes. Now, next slide. Sorry. Thanks. So in 2023, we put out a transition plan, FloodReady. The transition refers to the fact that FloodReady stops existing in 2039. So certain things need to happen between now and 2039 in order for us to exit the market. Those essentially amount to creating a sustainable market for resilience. So the things we're proposing to do under that, I'll get into, but it essentially create a kind of reinforcing cycle of resilient homes. Next slide. So Build Back Better is obvious our flagship program, which means when a home floods, it can now be rebuilt with an additional £10,000 for property level flood resilience measures, things that will protect the home in future, flood doors, windows, pumps, air reversible or self-closing air bricks, etc. This last winter was the first. It's also worth saying this is a world first. It's such a logical idea, but it's implemented here in the UK in the first case at real scale. Last winter was the first winter that this has been in place. We've got there's a dozen companies who are part of it. 75% of the market moving towards offering it. This was the first year, so it's not fully implemented across all properties, across all those insurers, but we're moving there. And so about 500 properties got Build Back Better last year, which actually is about comparable to what the EA scheme was doing a year and a half ago. So that's a positive. But the issue is that was a third of people, so 2/3 of people turned it down, and the reasons they're turning it down sometimes are the products take a little bit longer to get. And so they expect to be out of their homes a little bit longer. So that's where having kind of comparable supply times matters. And sometimes just after a flood, having that time to talk to people about that's not the time. So we actually need to have innovation in how we communicate this stuff as well. But then some of it is just people turning it down, and that's about how do we communicate, how do we make them aware, but also how do you create the incentives. So next slide. And part of that is about scoring this stuff. So showing the evidence about what works if you have a flood door and a pump and air bricks, self-closing air bricks. What does that do in terms of improving your flood resilience so that homeowners know? So that's the scoring part. And then there's the flood performance certificate part. Try I use the abbreviation there, but basically model on the energy performance certificate. Martin's going to talk about this a little bit later, but not specifically, not exactly like the energy performance certificate. We see it more as a platform for innovation. Different companies may find ways of implementing this in different ways, but basically it's a way of telling the homeowner, this is what you have in your home. This is what you can do to your home. It's also a way of telling the insurer and the mortgage lender, this home has protection measures, or can be protected. So it gives people it's kind of a consumer or public facing evidence base, and we're building out the methodology and the delivery device for that simultaneously. So it's a lot of things at once. Next slide. And as part of that, we see our kind of homes floods insurance hub, previously referred to as a center of excellence. It's our hub now, and modeled on the Thatcham Institute, which is where they did this sort of testing for cars. Different airbags, seatbelts, model designs mean different kinds of safety features or imply different levels of safety. So that Thatcham is basically for the automotive industry, we propose to do this for the home. HR Wallingford does it for large scale water applications, but we're trying to work on something that will actually do testing of the home measures, build out that evidence base, and be able to both demonstrate and measure what the effectiveness is, as well as doing research into things like behavioral. So next slide. And when it comes to innovation in communication, last year we did a garden at the Chelsea Flower Show, which turned out to be by far the biggest thing that we've done. It reached, the penetration metric was in the billions, and hits. So it really cut through, and people really, for a week, this was something that really got flood risk in the zeitgeist and top of people's minds. And so that was a way of, finding a way of innovating the messages. And we need to think about this behavioral aspect of connecting it to people's everyday activities and how they can start to become aware of flood risk and start to take action in their own homes. Next slide. So this is a map of those commitments and how those things sort of interact. So, we hope that they will start to create a self-reinforcing cycle. You'll see flood performance certificates is fairly central there. Next slide. And that's how these things we hope will help both scale and spark innovation. And I know this is really messy, but actually next slide. If you've ever seen a movie shoot, there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things happening simultaneously behind the scenes. It's a creative, innovative endeavor. Everything is always shifting, but it takes a huge amount of work elsewhere to actually produce what you see on the screen. And so in a way, there's a bit of a, like, obviously I'm using this as a metaphor for, we are doing a huge amount of simultaneous pieces of work in the background that will hopefully feed into something that consumers can see, can use, and will incentivize that market. Next slide. So things that are happening now. So the EA has scaled up its framework. BBB is, is underway, and properties are starting to uptake, so that the market is growing. It's on the government agenda. There's been a flood resilience task force, an insurance roundtable, and UKRI, so funding of research, had climate adaptation proposals earlier this year for the first time. So it's now being funded specifically, separate from mitigation. Our FPC roadmap was released in June, so that's kind of created that out. Next slide. And we're working with Hull. I think probably I could have talked a bit more about this, but it's underway, expected to start by early 2025, trying to do some of that, outfit an aquarium tank to be able to test these things. Our FloodReady hub, as I talked about, hoping to have those projects delivering in 2025, similar to a government timeframe for how some of these things are expected to roll out. The work is underway on PFR and on FPCs, and we have government having, one of DEFRA's priorities is PFR, as well as BBB and insurance. So it's a stated priority by government. The direction and guidance are still being awaited, and we hope, soon. But we really, there's a lot of wind in these sails. So we're pushing on a lot of different fronts to try to build that market so that the innovation actually has a receptor. And that's it. Thank you for your time. I'm just under, well, just on, hopefully. And yeah, I guess we turn it back to Richard. Thanks.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Jonathan. Great summary there of the PFR landscape and some of the terrific work that FloodReady are doing in that space. So hopefully that gives you the sense that there's lots and lots of moving parts and lots of things that are happening at the moment. Okay, so we'll now move on to the next presentation, which is from Jed Ramsey from Project Groundwater. So Jed's presentation will explain the challenge and the potential approaches for improving resilience to groundwater flooding. So with almost 25 years of experience, Jed has worked extensively in flood risk, rivers, and the environmental field. He's led numerous projects, from designing and building water supplies in the tropical rainforest to installing navigation facilities to building formal flood defences. And in addition, Jed has also played a hands-on role in coordinating responses to major floods and served as an on-call firefighter for several years. And Jed's currently leading Project Groundwater, which is an innovation project aiming to transform how groundwater flooding is understood and managed. So just a quick reminder again to use the Q&A function to post your questions for Jed and upvote those that you're interested in hearing responses to. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Jed. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, everyone. Yes, hi, I'm Jed from Buckinghamshire Council, and yeah, I'm going to start with a bit of a quiz. Just to say about chalk, actually. So, am I coming through okay? It looks like I've frozen from my side.
We can hear you, we just can't see you.
The video starts okay. I'll try restarting it. I'm back. Am I back?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about Project Groundwater and talk about flood resilience in the round, really. So not just from PFR point of view. I will talk about PFR as well, but I'm going to talk about more about the big picture of how you work with communities to make them resilient, particularly around groundwater flooding. Yeah, starting with a quiz. So the piece of chalk in question, if you can see it, it's this one here. It's kind of about as big as my head, or maybe a bit bigger. And yeah, it's not a live quiz, I'm afraid, but if you'd like to have a guess of what you think it is, and then I will let you know the answer. This piece of chalk, by the way, comes from a small quarry in Hertfordshire, and I've got it on loan from a geologist who's part of the Geological Society. I do have to give it him back. So yeah, the correct answer is C, so 1375 mil. It's about 30% of its volume, actually. So, and that kind of remarkable property of chalk, of it being porous and able to absorb and hold water, is on one hand what gives us this amazing resource in England, particularly for drinking water. About 40% of drinking water is taken from underwater groundwater sources. On the other hand, when groundwater levels get too high, you can end up with groundwater flooding. Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, just to give a little bit of explanation of the mechanism. So yeah, typically your groundwater sits down in usually a geological layer. It doesn't have to be chalk, but you can also have other, there's limestone in some areas, and London has it as artesian effect, for example. You might get pockets of it with other different geologies, and some parts of the country have it from old mines as well, actually. So yeah, so you get your rain, filters down, infiltrates through into your permeable layer, and then over time, if we go to the next slide, that rises, and then will emerge and probably cause flooding. Yeah, next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Yes, if we stay on that one, yeah. So some of the key differences in compared to other sources of flooding, which are your river, your coastal, your surface water. So it doesn't happen at the time that it rains. So typically it can be weeks afterwards, and once the water table's high, it tends to stay high. So last winter we had the highest groundwater levels in England for probably the last 10 years or so, and they stayed there up until April, May, from around January time. That was the kind of peak. So it was a very, very long, prolonged flood in some places. And it can sort of emerge in what seems like random locations in places where it's not been known in maybe recent memory to have appeared. And obviously, when we come to talk about PFR, the measures that typically get talked about with flood doors and non-return valves and so on, they aren't very effective when it's coming up through your floorboard, so you need to look at it differently. Oh, yeah, next slide, please. So Project Groundwater, we've got, it's a 6-year project funded by DEFRA as part of the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme. And we're just in year 4 now of those 6, and we've got a reasonably healthy budget of about just under 8 million, and we're looking at a wide range of topics. So really everything about how flood risk is managed by risk management authorities like myself at the council, the Environment Agency, water companies, but also how communities deal with it themselves. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is our vision for what we would hope to achieve, that will forever transform our communities, prepare and respond to groundwater flooding. Now, fairly ambitious, but we're also kind of starting from a reasonably low bar, because groundwater flooding is the least invested in, it's the least well understood, it's kind of poorly managed and poorly responded to as well. So, and there's been very little done over the years about it. Every area you look at it, the data's not there, the research isn't there, or the policy process is poor. So in every area, there's a lot to do. So it gives us a real load of things to do, but also it does mean I think we can make a real difference with this project. Next slide, please. So this, just to give you a bit more context for it, this is the areas we're working across. So 6 local authorities. We're the lead at Buckinghamshire, and then we've picked 9 pilot communities. Tried to pick a range. So most of those are on chalk, 3 are on permeable superficial deposits, so essentially river gravels in the floodplain. So we've got the Thames floodplain in Oxford, for example. And so we've got a variety of geologies, and then we've picked a variety of size of communities. So some are small, like Lambourne down in West Berkshire, up to more urban areas like Luton, and also with different levels of pre-existing engagement with flooding. So some have got flood groups, some haven't. Some, the awareness of flooding is low. The awareness of groundwater flooding in Luton is virtually non-existent, for example. So to give us that different context when you try new things and then you work with people, how well does it go? And obviously as you might imagine, the engagement has proved to be one of the most challenging parts of the project compared to the technical things. Yeah, next slide, please. And yeah, just to say, it's a big project. So as well as being well funded, we've got, I think, 37 partners now. We've tried to bring in all the leading people in who have knowledge of groundwater flooding. We've got most, I would say, involved to one degree or another, and we've got 4 universities working with us as well, about to bring in Cardiff University in January as well. So we've got kind of a mix of consultancies, research, local organisations, and also charities working with us as well. Next slide, please. Right, so just to dive now into a bit of the detail of what we're actually doing. So one of the areas around mapping. So there are 2 commercially available maps, national maps, showing groundwater flood risk, but they're only commercially available. The Environment Agency don't publish a national groundwater flood risk map. Officially, the responsibility for groundwater flooding lies with local authorities, and the Environment Agency have a strategic overview. Now, that has meant really that not much has happened. So, I mean, we're never going to get 140 odd local authorities to combine and produce a national map of groundwater flood risk. So this leaves us in a position where we don't really know the scale of the problem. Now, there's been some estimates by British Geological Survey, for example, but they didn't include everything. So, for example, it's kind of a false thing in a way to isolate the sources in the way that we do. So, isolating groundwater flooding from fluvial flooding from surface water flooding, in reality is they interact, and particularly river flooding and groundwater flooding. So on the chalk catchments that we're looking at, typically a chalk stream is 90% driven by groundwater. So to separate them out is kind of a misnomer, and it does create problems for us as a sector in how we manage this and how the funding is distributed. So in terms of mapping, what we've tried to do is we've developed, working with Jacobs on this one, they've developed a better modelling technique than has previously been available, and we're going to produce maps for the 6 counties that we cover and then publish those, and then really want to change in the longer term to work with the Environment Agency and DEFRA to get policy change so that this can be done nationally and incorporated into the national flood risk mapping. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but it does go back to legislation, policy, and funding ultimately. Next slide, please. Flood warning. So yeah, when we talk about resilience, one of the biggest things you can do to increase a community's resilience, 1 is to raise awareness of the maps, 2 is foreknowledge. So knowing a flood is coming has a huge impact. And in fact, I think we really undervalue flood warning in the UK, and we don't really recognise the value that it brings to the community to know that a flood is coming. The evidence shows that it has a massive impact on reducing, for example, the mental health impacts of flooding if you are signed up for flood warnings and if you receive those flood warnings. Groundwater flood warnings, there's some coverage by the Environment Agency in some places, but they tend to be fairly broad scale and not particularly accurate, and they're kind of done really on goodwill by the officers involved, I would say. Again, it goes back to that policy and funding question, because officially it comes down to local authorities to do groundwater flooding. So what we're doing, we've built a new groundwater flood system, and it's pretty automated. It's got a kind of learning loop in it. It uses an automated forecasting system, and then we're building a new, kind of quite nice portal with a company called 3-Sided Key. We've done some great stuff with the Red Cross and so on. So this is going to be live, I haven't got an exact date, but live in December for the 9 pilot communities that we're working with. And then again, ideally, we'd like to see this rolled out more widely to other communities. I mean, in my view, this should be done nationally once, right? But again, we're quite a way off that. But I think in the future, that is where we'll get to, that this should become incorporated with the national flood warning service. So we had the really good one that the Environment Agency run with the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre and so on. Next slide, please. My next prop, right? I've had some problems with my camera today, but I'm hoping you can see this one. So essentially, I've got a jug of water here, and I've got this. I've got this on loan from some old colleagues of mine at the Environment Agency. It's got a very long thing. And then when it goes in water, it beeps and makes a light. This is called a dipper, and they're still using these today to essentially measure groundwater levels. So you'd go to a borehole, and there's a surprising number of them actually, and for many of them, they're dipped maybe once a month with something like that, literally hand recorded. In England, we actually have the oldest, it's not the oldest boreholes because I think they maybe go back to Roman times, but we've got the one with the longest continuous monitoring record, which goes back to 1836. So I thought I should probably go and find this if we can see the next slide. It is down in it's down in Chelgrove House in Sussex. Pretty remarkable thing for what it is, considering its history. And these boreholes are typically put in to monitor low groundwater levels. So going back to the use of groundwater for drinking water as a source of drinking water and everything else. So how we manage abstraction. Now, they're not really designed for groundwater flooding, but of course, quite a lot of them we found are in a pretty good place for groundwater flooding. And if we can update what we do there, we can, again, do a better job of how we monitor, and then you can better warn and you can better understand. But also, I think we can probably do a bit better. If we go to the next slide. And so this is a kind of side project we've got. This is a military drone that's been developed for the British Army. And it has, amongst all the things on there, well, the bit that caught my interest was it has a ground penetrating radar, which kind of shows you where the water table is. Now, if we can get this to work, which is a big question, it could potentially allow you to, rather than relying on a kind of, a point here from the borehole here and a point here, and then you're extrapolating your water table in between, you could actually get a full picture across a large area with this. But I mean, it's still got quite a few challenges, but we are working to develop that one over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. And that goes again back to the data and understanding and awareness. The better we understand source of flooding, the better we can be, the more resilient we are to it. So the planning system is another one. I mean, we're talking about building back better, which I think is a great scheme, and you can see a lot of what FloodReady are doing is a really, really positive in terms of the industry. But I think a lot of people would say, well, if anyone deals with the public, you quite often hear this from them, you shouldn't let them build in the floodplain in the first place. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true so much these days. I don't think there is as much building in the floodplain as historically there has been. But when it comes to groundwater, that lack of data, the lack of maps, the lack of information, the lack of modelling means that actually we don't really know where the groundwater flood risk problem is. So that is there, but that is also compounded with the guidance around planning is particularly poor for groundwater when you compare it to other sources of flood. So there's no statutory consultee. The National Planning Policy Framework, which we just responded to the consultation, is pretty woolly, could really be strengthened up around this. So we're going to be developing a set of guidance based on what you can do with the kind of policy and law as it is, what local authorities are the best they can do, but then also really make a bit of noise and campaign to get this changed in the longer term. So again, I think it's just something we can do better. It seems like an open door, but you do need the fundamentals of data in place for that to work. Next slide, please. Finally, we get to the PFR. So this is, as I said earlier, I mean, this is a project I put in before I worked on Project Groundwater, actually down in Chesham. So you're fairly standard PFR. You've got flood barriers on the school on the right, and then another kind of flood barrier on that door on the left. Now these work really, really well, and the industry's come a long way. The products are really robust, and there's some fantastic stuff out there, and there's still a lot of innovation going on in that sector. Now, if you talk about groundwater and PFR, you're essentially limited to putting in a pump in and maybe waterproofing the internal part of your property. Now, it can be horrendously expensive, or you're looking at resilience measures, so making yourself recover better rather than the kind of resistance keeping the water out. So, and it's a bit limited, and our kind of discussion with people across the industry is that, again, the knowledge and expertise around groundwater flooding is pretty thin, and the guidance is thin. And things like, for example, if you want to put in a pump, how do you size it? How do you how do you calculate what size of pump's needed for the, and how do you measure when to turn it on and everything. This kind of knowledge is not really there. There are people who have it, and there's been some really good examples we've seen. But again, we're going to try and work with people to build some guidance, better guidance, but also try and research some better measures and fund a bit of research in that area. So I hope we can do something to improve the offering really to people in terms of groundwater flooding and how PFR can be used and applied. Next slide, please. Natural flood management. Looks like we might have lost the picture there. I did have a picture there of some leaky barriers, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. But when you come to using natural flood management to help with groundwater flooding, there's very little research. Kind of instinctively, you might think it's not going to help. But I think we've got a few ideas on perhaps once thinking of it, not in terms of influence the water table itself, but in terms of influencing it once it's on the surface. And what I talked about earlier in terms of the interaction between groundwater and other sources of flooding, you've got to look at it more holistically. So we're going to be doing a few trials over the next couple of years, and that's what Cardiff are going to work with us on in terms of evaluating and monitoring it and then publishing some academic research in that area. Next slide, please. And just a little, this is again going back to the what we're talking about resilience as a broader concept. Now, mental health, in my view, is one of the it should be the focus of a lot of what we do. So some statistics here for you. If you are flooded in the 2 years that follow that flood event, internally property flooded in your house, then you have a 25% chance of developing PTSD. You're 5 times more likely to develop anxiety and 7 times more likely to suffer from depression. Now, this is just quite astonishing to me, and the cost to society as a whole of these kind of mental health impacts. The research shows it far outweighs the actual cost of damage to the property. Now, the problem is this kind of stuff is not easily quantified. The data's not there. And at the moment, you can't get funding to do things, flood risk schemes that help reduce mental health impacts. It just doesn't stack up under the way the funding system works at the moment, because it doesn't, we're geared towards reducing flood risk to properties. So we're commissioning a big partnership in this area, hopefully starting in January. We've got 3 universities, UK Health Security Agency, Environment Agency, of course. Could be really exciting, but big goal is to change the funding system in the long term. I think we're probably talking 5-10 years to do that, but really to swing it away from property and more towards people. That's the aim there. And I really feel, again, you're talking about flood resilience. What could you do in this area to help people? It's not even clear what the options would be. I'm sure there are many, but there's never been that much thought put into it. So really exciting area and big area for change for the future, I think. I'm almost at the end. If we go to the next slide. In fact, I think that is the end. So yeah, just if you want to sign up for updates for our projects, Project Groundwater, or just Google us. There's actually 3 of us. There's another one in Lincolnshire, and there's one up in Newcastle as well. But we're down in Chilterns and Berkshire. Or free to drop me a line as well. But thanks very much.
Fantastic, thank you, Jed, and great use of props in your presentation. That's a new one. Yeah, groundwater flooding is a really difficult thing to manage and mitigate against, so it's fantastic to hear about the innovative approaches that Jed and team are taking to tackle this area of resilience. So we'll now move swiftly on to the next presentation, which is from Gail Alexander from the Devon Resilience Innovation Project, or DRIP. So Gail's presentation will provide an overview of approaches to deliver PFR. So Gail's the project manager on the DRIP project, which is part of the FCRIP program, so the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Program. The project is operating Devon-wide with 19 partners, and Gail leads on the PFR for community asset buildings elements of the project. And she's here to talk about the learnings on delivery within both the DRIP project and delivery through the normal grant in aid route within Devon County Council's flood risk team. Just remember, if you've got any questions, please use the Q&A function. Also, have a look at the questions that are already in there and vote for your favourite questions by upvoting them. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Gail.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks to Paul for inviting me to take part in this. And hello to everyone watching this webinar. Next slide, please. So there's a bit of, but before I start, there's a bit of a caveat really. I've only been in the position of project manager on this project since August, when our existing project manager left. So previous to that, I was a project officer and went through quite a complicated internal recruitment to get me in place as manager now. But as the project officer, I led on our NFM pilot projects and on the PFR pilot projects. And coming from a background where I hadn't really dealt with PFR, although I was a member of the Flood and Coastal Risk Management team at Devon County Council, it's been quite a journey, I have to say. So the inside story, that slide, that photo does what it says on the tin. Those are some of the examples of flooding that we come across in Devon. We have a lot of rapid response catchments. Our closest facsimile is Cumbria, and we take a lot of our research from Lancaster University, along with our own homegrown unis who are also concerned with particularly NFM and carry out a lot of research in that area. Now, previous to the DRIP project, to our FCRIP project, our prime source of local government funded PFR was our capital grant in aid residential PFR scheme, which is run by two of my colleagues in FCRIP. It started in 2018. So far, there have been 225 properties protected in excess of 125 locations throughout Devon, I am reliably assured. And there's been an investment of 10.4 million so far. So far, so good. Anyone who works in PFR will understand the very specific challenges it presents in terms of engaging communities. So next slide, please. So this scheme was pre-existing, and then along came DRIP. And as part of this FCRIP project, we developed Work Package 2, which is our PFR work package. We have a budget of 6.5 million. We have 19 project partners. So another big project, but Work Package 2 is really run by myself with a consultant and another colleague from the team. Now, I think the people who developed the work packages, because they weren't me, I wasn't here at that point, really wanted to look sort of closely at how to innovate around PFR. And with the experience that we had in already delivering PFR for a year at that point, they kind of wanted to zoom in and see where we could increase resilience in communities without using residential PFR, because we already have a scheme for that. So we started to look at the gaps in provision around PFR. Obviously, people privately fund their own residential PFR, and we have a scheme available. So we started thinking, well, if people have PFR in their own homes, that's one thing. But what about the people who can't afford it? What about the people who live in more deprived areas? What happens to them in a big flood event? What happens to them when they can't really live in their own homes? And so we began to look outward and think, well, what normally happens in a big flood event? People all go and gather somewhere. If there's an emergency plan, there will be places of shelter which are named in that plan. And then that led people onto thinking, well, what happens if those places are affected? What happens if those places are impacted? So that would be the pubs, the cafes, anywhere else where you can get hot or cold food and drink, like your local shop, the places of shelter, so village halls, churches, schools. What happens if those places are out of action, especially in a small rural catchment where it's hard for emergency services to get through to you if you're flooded? It's hard for you to get in touch with anyone else if your mobile phone runs out and you've got no electricity. What happens to those communities? So there was born the idea that it would be a really good idea to target community asset buildings, what we call community asset buildings, for PFR, to protect them and to protect the opportunity for shelter and for a community to come together and for people to access food and drink in these situations. When you can protect your places of shelter and protect your places that provide people with normality in a flood event, you can also, off the back of that, build a flood plan if there isn't one already. Build a community plan, and there's a bit more assuredness, there's a bit more confidence that the places of safety, the places where you go to get help, will be there in order for you to enact that plan. It also means that people can stay within their community to help each other on the road to recovery. So next slide, please. So these were the gaps which were kind of considered for innovation, and I've already covered that really, but they come under the FCRIP resilience interventions and actions, of which there are 10. So these are the stated aims, which were the drivers for looking at this particular area in which to kind of find more innovation and build up a knowledge base. So property flood resilience is one of the resilience interventions and action. So enacting that, designing schemes that fulfill the aims of the FCRIP projects. Community infrastructure resilience. So that again is to build up and to shore up the frameworks which allow communities to operate within an emergency, which allow them to recover, which allow them to help each other, which allow them to kind of recover better, to function better, to know that there are protections there, and to also enable them to function independently, either before emergency services can get there or in the reduced funding landscape that we now live in as RMAs. Resilience action number 6, minimise damages and disruption to small and medium-sized businesses. So we couldn't target it at every business. We don't have that kind of funding. So we kind of narrowed that down. But as some of these community assets are businesses selling food and drink primarily, then we could at least fulfill that resilience intervention. Community and voluntary sector action to be better prepared and recover more quickly. I've kind of covered that really, but that was, I think, the main driver for this particular innovation, this particular work package. So next slide, please. So the community asset buildings, we had to nail down what they are and what they aren't. So we had to do things like decide if a gelato shop was a community asset because it sells food. Now, I'd say a gelato shop is a community asset in any community, but it might be more appropriate for you to protect a pub in a community, one which has seating, indoor seating and toilets, and if you protect it and it's still functioning, can serve hot food and drink or cold food and drink, indeed, to anyone who needs it. And it can act as a hub. And if you can protect that place so that their electricity still functions, kind of difficult, but possible, then they can also be a hub for communications. They can be a hub for emergency services to gather. So our criteria really were that they were centered around food. We also targeted doctor surgeries. And we dithered, I think, about targeting other healthcare practitioners, i.e. dentists, because we felt that it might be useful and it might be another thing to retain some sense of normality if people can keep appointments. But we then kind of had to be careful. We had to pull it back a bit and think about how these criteria needed to be applied. And so I think the criteria it boiled down to were hot food and drink or cold food and drink, anywhere a community can gather and take shelter and keep warm, anywhere where they can sleep, anywhere where they can exercise out of the rain, anywhere where they can sort of come together and give support to each other. So that's what we are calling a community asset, any building or organisation which can do that in a flood event. The overall benefit in resilience is at this moment in time qualitative, because we have not applied any quantitative data monitoring, because we've had no installs yet. We are going to install, but we've had no actual installations taking place yet. But it'll be the qualitative data, which I think will be the most important thing to come out of this. It will be speaking to communities to ask them if they feel more resilient after the fitting of, after the installations which we're going to carry out, and measuring the kind of appetite maybe for more in the future. So I think in Devon, we are seeing the same as everyone else with climate change and with a huge amount of development, regardless of SODS conditions. There's been an enormous amount of development in very rural areas in Devon recently, over the past 3 years. And last year, we had a particularly sort of memorable year. Last September, we had 400 homes internally flooded. So obviously our future forecast is that these events are not going to go away and will also increase in their severity and their frequency. So the overall DRIP PFR budget, so the FCRIP portion of the budget for this work package is 350,000, which might sound like a lot for PFR, but we have found it isn't necessarily. So moving on to the kind of differences in challenge between the capital grant funded schemes and the DRIP scheme. The main one, and any of you who are kind of trying to take PFR out to a community rather than having a community come to you and ask you for it, will understand this. So the residential PFR scheme, the main issue with that, or the main benefit of that, is that it's reactive. Residents know that it exists. Within our team, there is a regular awareness raising campaign around the fact that PFR exists and can be funded up to a certain amount on residential homes which have internally flooded. So it's reactive. Residents come to us. There's minimal engagement required. It does happen sometimes, but it's not really the hard grind that we've experienced trying to take PFR out to communities. So the DRIP PFR scheme, it's proactive. We have had to go out there and engage to try and get people to understand that this is a good thing for them to do. We didn't carry out the sort of expansive engagement that I think, upon reflection, that we should have done, because we had a staffing issue around that time. The previous project officer left, so there was a delay there in the inception of this particular work package. So the proactive nature of what you have to do with the engagement around community assets that we have found takes an awful lot of time. It takes a hell of a lot of time. And the main issues that we had were people simply not believing that we would be giving them a grant to cover the whole cost of survey and installation on a specific building. So it has been a real uphill struggle trying to get any installs at all. We do have installs now going through, but it's been a real issue trying to get out there and trying to get people to believe that this is free, that it comes from the council, that it's not a scam, and to understand the reasons why we're wanting to carry out this piece of work. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'm just kind of reiterating what I've said previously, really. So as you would expect, the amount of engagement that we've had to do and had to go out to, it's ranged from the initial email, second initial email, phone call, then another phone call, and this is with a letter at the start as well, and then the inevitable door knocking. So driving literally around the county, knocking on people's doors, and there have been many challenges to that, because community asset buildings, quite often they're leased, Quite often they are shut in the evenings and at the weekends. Quite often you can look on parish council websites to find out the ownership of a hall or another similar building, and the details are out of date, or you can't find any details. So even just trying to sort of nail people down to contact about the fact that they can get grant funded free PFR installs is hard. So even before that, if you go even before that, we've got to do all of the groundwork as well. We have to do the usual thing that we do before a PFR survey. So all of the desk-based studies, we've hired consultants who do that for us. JBA are involved in that. To identify even the community asset buildings within a catchment which are at risk. So the issues we've had are the new EA framework. So really we weren't ready enough last December to start to procure installations, and we missed the deadline for procuring our second set of surveys. So that then went through council, finance, legals, procurement, as you would expect, for 3 months, which put us back a lot. Now, any independent procurement would have put us back a lot more, but to get the new framework signed up, it was a really critical period for us, and that was a big challenge that we faced. So there are kind of issues. Oh, you're right, Richard. Am I banging on?
Probably another couple of minutes, Gail, if that's right.
Oh, wow. Okay, sorry. So I think those are the issues. Probably next slide is going to be a good idea now. Thank you. So these are our main lessons. These are the main sort of take-ups from going through this whole process. The uptake has been very slow. So this proactive community asset PFR, the uptake has been really, really slow. There have been people who've been frightened about the resale value of their businesses. They've been unsure of what the decision-making process is because they're tenants, or because there's a committee that manages the buildings. There has been a degree of climate change denial as well, as I find kind of on a regular basis with anything to do with flood. I also have managed the NFM work packages. The group decision-making around buildings where there are committees or management groups inevitably takes longer when you're not just dealing with one resident. There's a high proportion of listed buildings, particularly with the church halls, memorial halls. I've mentioned the framework, and FCRIP, because there's been no rollover policy, the delays that we have experienced have been kind of waiting, having to draw down risk, or waiting for the next financial year before we can deliver the next lot of interventions, and we've had considerable underspend because of that. So probably next slide now, please. Engagement, lessons learned, engagement, extensive engagement. We needed to put it out probably on our county council socials. We needed much earlier on. There was a fear in us around having a lot of people rush towards us wanting a very finite amount of grant funding. I just don't think that would have happened on reflection. So next time it has to be a much wider scope for the engagement. I think the other thing is that there's no lot 4 with the new EA framework. So we've had to procure a managing agent, and that has, inherent its own sort of delays and troubles. And we needed a dedicated resource rather than pulling in people for match hours from our team, because it's a complex subject if you're not very knowledgeable about PFR, and it takes a lot of upskilling. So next slide, please. We have got 6 installs after 16 months of engagement. Now that sounds like a really tiny amount, but it feels huge to us. We've got 6 installs, and they're beginning very soon. We've got 20 surveys. People have accepted 20 surveys on properties, and of those, 6 have gone to installation. We're doing a new round of surveys. So we hope to just get in before the end of our significant funding period and get some more installations done. And then also for us, it will be the data gathering and the impact and outcomes, just to inform how we carry out these innovative schemes going forwards. So I think I can probably end there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Gail. Really fascinating to hear about the delivery between all the sorts of different programs that you're managing, and the great work that you're doing with communities in Devon. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So we'll now move on to the next presentation, which is a joint presentation from Martin Lennon of FloodReady and Alan Ryan of the RAIN project. And their presentation will provide an overview of the role of flood performance certificates, which were introduced earlier on, and flood recoverability in supporting improved flood resilience. So Martin is head of transition at FloodReady. He's working on various projects related to PFR, including a scoring methodology to assess PFR efficacy at property level, and the development of a flood performance certificate to demonstrate this information. And Alan works for West Northants Council and is currently managing the RAIN project, which is part of the FCRIP programme. And prior to that, he managed the OxCam PFR Pathfinder. So over to you first, Martin.
Hi, thanks for that, Richard. I'm going to try and be as quick as I can because really I'm just the intro and Alan is the substance of this presentation. And I'm really touching upon issues that have been covered quite well in this topic. So Jonathan gave a really good overview earlier of sort of where flood performance certificates sit, or where we think they sit within the kind of structure around PFR and why they're really important. I just wanted to use these few minutes introducing this to pick up on a point that Gail made really well, I thought, and I think reflects Alan's own experience. I think he'll touch on a bit more, but why he asked me to speak, which is the amount of work involved at the moment at engaging householders in projects, and quite how complicated it is for a householder to understand what they're being offered and to think about the options that they're given. And I feel like PFR professionals at the minute almost have to be like proselytizing, explaining it to householders time and time again and giving them a lot of detail. And that's okay, but it's the first stage in the process. And if a householder then needs to try and repeat all that information to seller, to someone else, to their lender, insurer, etc., it gets complicated. So we really just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just saying why we think FPCs are important for that kind of interface between householders and PFR. So, really recap the basics here. An FPC is directly equivalent to an EPC in that it wants to help householders understand what level of resilience their property has, how to improve their property's level of resilience so that they're better prepared, and explain it to other people so that it's part of a system. I think sometimes the energy performance certificates are a bit maligned and they've been, they aren't thought to have achieved everything they could have done. I'd say that there is very good evidence in the UK and around the world that the one thing which makes the biggest difference when we're looking for people, consumers, householders to make energy efficiency adaptations is clear labeling and a structure to understand that. So you understand where you're from, where you're going to, how you can compare two products. And there's some, quite a lot of meta-analysis out there now which show it can be done better or worse, but it's a requisite for changing household behavior. And I think just so I could have the next slide, just to remind us, and it's been touched on, but I want to use this structure. This is a behavior change model that FloodReady developed a few years ago and has then taken forwards by the Environment Agency and the Behavioural Insights team. And it actually shows the number of processes we've got to take a householder through in order for them to understand it. Firstly, am I at risk? Secondly, is it my responsibility to act? Thirdly, is there something that I can do? Fourthly, can I afford it and it's cost effective? And fifthly, can I avoid unintended consequences? And again, I think Gail touched on that quite well, where people are actually saying, well, does it just draw attention to the fact that I'm at flood risk? Is it a blight on my house? Is it ugly, etc.? So these questions come up. that's before they take action. If they're then going to think about taking action, then they've got to decide, well, is this option right for me? Does this package work for me? What does it do? There's a whole load of technical questions they've got to interpret. Flood performance certificates aren't the answer to this, and they obviously don't allow you to afford it really. But they do provide a structure to answer these questions and to help frame that relationship between professional and householder when we're sort of explaining to householders what they can do. We think it will be particularly important in the BBB process, where householders are making decisions in quite a compressed time zone at a time when they're out the house, when there's a lot of like other things going on and a lot of confusion for them. And that's really why we think it's really important. I'm not going to go into all the bits that we're doing to create it. We've got a roadmap for that. I'll put the details of that in the chat. But just really, we wanted to recap that if we can create this framework, we can use it in a number of different ways. And that is my last slide, Paul, and then I will shut up and let Alan get on with the meaty bit of his presentation. Which these are the jobs that we think a framework, a flood performance certificate framework enables. Oh look, Barbara's already put it in the chat. She's ahead of me. Firstly, it's about householders, right? You know, I think it's householders and everything else. But if we create that framework and we create that system, it can also be reflected back at householders and the other bits of the times when they might need it. So a framework, a PFR framework allows adaptations to be considered by insurers assessing risk. At the moment, insurance is done for householders, not for businesses, but for householders on scale. It's done on a mass basis. There needs to be a very simple way for insurers to take account of PFR. Same with lending. We think it will, an FPC framework will allow PFR to be mainstreamed in flood mitigations because it will give a clearer basis for business cases. It will be a simpler way of comparing PFR to NFM, SUD schemes, traditional defences, etc. And also part of the planning process. So we heard earlier the question of whether or not we should be building new homes, and actually, well, we sort of do need to build new homes in areas of the country which are at flood risk. So the question is not should we, but how we. And then if we have a framework that could sort of demonstrate how they were protected, that would make the how much easier. Right. I hope that's my sort of sales pitch. I'm going to let now Alan do the meaty part of this discussion, which I think really reinforces this point. So what Alan's really trying to pioneer here is some work about resilience measures, and which proposes an even bigger challenge at engaging householders.
Thanks, Martin. I'm not sure meaty is the correct term, but I'll give it a go. I think so. What innovation actually is could probably be presentation itself, but I'm going to talk about how we need to think about what PFR actually is, what that actually includes, and how the different elements interact with each other. So Martin touched on it, saying that it's an umbrella term to any adaptations you can make in your property. And I think that's the idea of it being this wider issue. So in terms of flood risk management, we need to stop thinking about stopping water from entering properties and take a more holistic approach that combines preparedness at a property and a community level, resistance and recoverability to build properly, truly resilient communities. So the work we're doing with RAIN Project, as well as with BeFloodReady, our mission is to empower communities by helping them to understand, prepare for, and recover from flooding. Within the RAIN Project itself, we've got multiple work streams that try to address local surface water flood risk and issues from a number of different angles. So it's the combination of using NFM to reduce flood risk across the catchment level, working with communities to help them become more resilient to flooding through education, sharing our flood risk modeling with them, raising awareness, and then finally at the property level using PFR itself. However, what we've found is similar to the interactions and the interdependencies of the different elements within PFR, which I'm about to talk about, our work streams also have a number of overlaps and mutual benefits and dependencies on each other as well. So next slide, please, Richard or Paul. So I think my focus is trying to get away from this idea of stopping water from entering your property and PFR being a resistance thing only. So when people think about PFR, the first thing they usually think of is resistance measures, preventative measures designed to keep floodwaters out, such as flood doors, barriers, self-closing air breaks, etc. I think it's only natural to consider keeping the water out in the first place as being the most important thing you need to do, because in reality, if you do that, then you've actually succeeded in avoiding your property from flooding. So it's the right thing. However, the problem with that is in order to do so, you need to be properly prepared, and resistance alone won't work anyway then. So if you don't have a flood plan, if you're not signed up to flood alerts, and Jed talked about the importance of that already, then you mightn't actually have time to correctly deploy your PFR. Then there's the issue of, even when resistance measures are properly tested, they're properly installed, properly utilized, and also very, very importantly, properly maintained, then there's still the potential for water to get in, whether that's through allowed leakage rates, overtopping, or unexpected ingress routes. Then this is when recoverability also comes into parts of a successful strategy. The National Flood School over at HR Wallingford actually provide training to loss adjusters and people working in disaster care and recovery. And they talk a lot about how water will also get in through cavity walls, for example, come up through the ground, like Jed has the issues with groundwater. But also between the joints of the wall and the floor is another common entry point. So again, just stopping water at the door isn't a solution, and we must look beyond that basic resistance message. Next slide, please, Paul. So I think we need to stop thinking about PFR as a fit and forget type solution. The problem with resistance measures is that apart from barriers, and most measures are passive, it means then that no intervention is required in the event of a flood, and it's easy to be lulled into this false sense of thinking that it's over and done with and you're now protected. When people think about preparedness, it's usually in the context of education around flood risk, encouraging sign up to flood alerts, having household emergency plans, and understanding the actions to take before, during, and after a flood. While all this is true and all very important, I think preparedness also extends to PFR itself, and that can be sometimes a forgotten piece of the jigsaw. Like I said, PFR is not fit and forget, and it needs to be something that you embrace learning to live with in order for it to actually be as effective as possible. So ensuring your products are properly stored and maintained, understanding how to correctly deploy your products in the event of flooding as part of a flood plan, and also practicing in advance so that you know what to do if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you've got your flood alert. It's not the first time you've ever tried to use these products. Next slide, please, Paul. So the good thing about preparedness is that actually it's mostly very cheap or costs nothing, and it's mostly around behavioral things that can be done in advance. So the examples on screen are just things that can be done as part of a well thought out flood plan, but can have a significant impact in the event of a flood and how much damage is actually caused. I'd like to thank Mary Longdonu for sharing these pictures and some of the other ones I've used in my presentation. And Mary's actually got lots of really good examples in our EMAG of recoverable measures and recoverability done really well. Next slide, please. So what is recoverability? So there's things that you can do, or measures that allow properties to recover more quickly after a flood has occurred, that'll minimize long-term disruption or financial impact, or the need to even make a claim on insurance. Where we think about resistance is more about what's already been done and put in place, and preparedness then focusing on what you can do in the present. Recoverability sits more in the future and what you can still do to make your property more resilient to flooding going forwards. I think the key to recoverability is timing and knowing what to do and when. So we're not saying that it makes sense to rip out a perfectly good kitchen or rip up new carpets and replace them with resilient alternatives, but it's rather being mindful that when making changes to your property, can you do so in a way to make it more resilient to flooding? I'd categorize recoverability into kind of 4 key categories when making natural changes or upgrades to your property in the aftermath of a flood, proactively installing recoverable measures, or building with resilience in mind in the first place. So the cheapest option is, if you're already making changes to your property, to consider a flood resilient alternative. And quite often there is little, if any, additional cost involved in choosing a resilient option than replacing it for like. So if you take the kitchen shown, for example, replacing your existing kitchen with one that has higher legs or a floating kitchen, or even choosing a stainless steel or a plastic alternative, doesn't necessarily cost any more than a traditional non-resilient one does. And I think an important thing to consider as well is it's not about dropping standards, as I've seen some of the flood resilient kitchens now, and they're way nicer than the one I've got and gives me kitchen envy. So it's not about compromising either. Next slide, please. So the next opportunity to think about recoverability is in the aftermath of a flood event itself. So Jed has touched on, and we've chatted previously with him before, on the mental impacts of flooding and everything that's involved in that. And Mary has spent years campaigning and trying to explain to people the horrors of flooding. And we need to consider the people at the actual heart of this, and it's not all technical products. So the impact of someone's home flooded can be life-changing through the loss of irreplaceable sentimental items, being out of your home for a long period of time, maybe having to live in a cordoned off part of your house while work is being done, or the ongoing stress and anxiety then that you get every time the next storm hits. So FloodReady's Build Back Better helps make the appropriate adaptations instead of just putting things back the way they were, to help minimize the damage that future flooding may cause and to help the homeowner and the property recover quicker. So things like replacing carpets with ceramic flooring, with waterproof adhesive and grouting, replacing timber skirting with plastic skirting, raising electrical sockets, using waterproof products and walls such as dragon board or lime plaster. These are all things that reduce the damage done if water enters a property and help recover quicker. Then there's what I classify as being proactive recoverability options. So these are less about actual specific products and more about how to use things in a more resilient manner. So this is about things like relocating or raising up white goods, boilers, fuse boards, etc. And it isn't something as expensive as replacing the items if damaged in a flood, or the impact it has on reducing the impact of flooding. So there's no such thing as a flood resilient washing machine or dishwasher, but by putting them up on a flood resilient surface, you can actually keep them out of flood water, and then you don't need to replace them if water comes in. Raising electric sockets or fuse boards, if they're low down, can have a significant impact on whether it's safe to actually stay in your property after flooding, or affect how long you might need to be out for. So these are things that can be proactively done in advance to make a property more resilient to flooding. And then, as Jed and Martin have both touched on, the last category for me is build better first. So our residents are always on to me about, why do we keep building in floodplains, or they reference new development where there's historic flood issues. It's not a debate I'm going to get into now, but the reality is that surface water flooding is increasing, and some properties that have yet to be built will undoubtedly be affected by surface water flooding at some point. If there is a known flood risk, even if it's considered to be tolerable for development, then considering building in recoverability as a strategy in the house design itself is the most cost-effective time to do so. So it's a lot cheaper just to use self-closing air bricks to start with than having to retrofit them. The same goes for having raised electrical sockets. It's just an actual choice at design. Placing appliances on raised surfaces, considering flooring types and protection at the bottom of walls and along the joint in the floor. These are all things that actually cost very little, if any more in some cases, when a property is being first built, than something that needs to be considered and then retrofitted. So finally, I'll just finish up with this image to just kind of reiterate and represent the balancing act that's required between resistance, preparedness, and recoverability when it comes to PFR, and how all are actually dependent on each other in order for a successful strategy for flood resilience to be as effective as possible. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alan. Big thanks to both Martin and Alan there for your presentation. It's really intriguing to see the potential that flood performance certificates could have in stimulating more uptake of resilience measures, and also a great reminder that PFR isn't just about keeping water out, it's about reducing damages and enabling people to get back to normal a lot quicker. Please remember to ask questions in the Q&A. I see Jed's already been in there answering some of the groundwater specific ones, so thank you, Jed. Also, please upvote those questions that you're most interested in. So now we're going to move on to the final presentation from Paul Cobbing, who's working on the Resilient Roach FCRIP project. Paul's presentation will outline some of the challenges and approaches to considering and using insurance to improve financial resilience when also improving flood resilience. Paul's an independent consultant who's been working in the flood risk industry for many, many years, including for over 10 years as chief exec of the National Flood Forum. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Richard. So the Resilient Roach project, in fact, we'll move straight on to the next slide. There was a report called the Rochdale Flood Poverty Report, which was produced with funding from the Northwest RFCC, which started to look at the issues around the interlinkages between flooding, flood risk, and poverty in deprived areas. And the link there will take you to the report and the executive's summary. So can I have the next slide, please? And really what that showed was that there is a strong correlation and a circularity between flooding, housing, and deprivation. And you can see here on the plan, on the map, the sort of link between groups of flooded properties and indices of multiple deprivation. And the report explores that interplay and comes out with some interesting stuff, including the importance of understanding the community and place in that whole dialogue. And it's about navigating complex governance arrangements, the role of local actors and organisations. And within that, it became clear the importance of financial resilience and insurance within that overall vulnerability discussion. Next slide, please. So there's some interesting work nationally which shows the link between low-income families and or low-income renters and the lack of uptake of contents insurance. And basically, that comes out to 37% issue overall. And that's showing a remarkable coincidence with some of the work that we've been undertaking. Next slide, please. So in this, we're currently doing some survey work and we're coming out with very similar numbers. 30% of people have insurance, contents insurance. 30% of people definitely don't have insurance, and 30% of people don't know. So for financial resilience is often represented by property insurance, buildings and contents insurance. And in reality, this is what most of us rely on to recover, to cope with big unforeseen events like flooding. But with only a third of people having been known to have this sort of insurance, that places communities like this at an additional disadvantage compared to most communities, in Rochdale at least, but we suspect wider. What we've done actually as part of the PFR surveys is to ask about insurance. And what's that resulted in is quite a detailed picture of insurance take-up on a street-by-street basis, a house-by-house basis, actually. And the PFR survey work is being undertaken as part of a combined energy efficiency, PFR, and build quality retrofit approach to targeted some 300 properties. We've surveyed something like 270 We've got, I think it's about 70 homeowner agreements out for signing at the moment, but it's part of an ongoing process. And the final thing on this one is we've also had discussions with social housing providers and with social housing insurance policy insurance companies or brokers, and they're coming up with similar figures for what they believe to be the number of people who are insured. In the case of social housing, typically 15% take up the low-cost social insurance housing, and other people use things like their bank account insurance offered through their bank accounts. That's coming up with similar numbers. Next slide, please. So the practical and financial impacts of this lack of insurance is if the tenant doesn't have contents insurance, they might lose their possessions, including items of sentimental value, and then there's the mental health impacts. If the landlord isn't insured and the tenant floods, the tenant may end up living in a damp house, or they may have the cost of moving, losing possessions, and may struggle to find anywhere to rent. And in addition to all the emotional health impacts, the tenants may have to continue paying rent. And landlords are under no obligation to take out insurance. And when I was working with the National Flood Forum, this was a regular occurrence. So people would end up paying 2 lots of rent effectively. And then if a homeowner is not insured and can't afford to reinstate their home, again, they'll live in a damp and damaged house, they'll lose possessions, suffer health and emotional impacts and so on. They might get donations from charitable bodies, but they have to afford the cost of stripping out the house and reinstating it. Clearly, if you're in a disadvantaged situation to start with, all of that becomes very difficult and can help drive poverty. Next slide, please. So here is the flooding and deprivation link. People with fewer resources move into areas with cheaper housing, renting or owning. Cheap housing is cheaper because it is in poor condition or it is at risk of flooding. Many landlords and homeowners do not or cannot afford to invest in their properties to make them habitable. And when flooding does occur, those houses are vulnerable because they're poor build and or have poor maintenance records. So that after flooding, homes may not be dried out or reinstated, leading to the health issues that we have heard about in the Our case, for example. And then people who are without insurance are particularly vulnerable. They bear the costs or live in a damp and mouldy homes, both driving deprivation and poverty. Next slide, please. So in summary, and there is a big summary, we're looking, the recommendation out of the flood poverty reports is that we should be investing beyond the usual suspects. This isn't just a flood risk management sector delivery issue. This means strategic coordination across a range of sectoral investment programs. Can we invest in resilience through other programs? Can we work with other professional stakeholders in different sectors to improve resilience, such as financial resilience? And can we use existing networks to deliver that? And we're doing this not just in terms of financial resilience, but across the full range of interventions on a catchment level scale. Next slide, please. So from a resilient roach point of view, again, one of the FCRIP projects, we're looking at this integrated approach where we're looking, where traditionally flood risk management reduces risks but doesn't eliminate it. And where people are more vulnerable, such as in deprived areas, the impact of that residual risk can be much greater than perhaps elsewhere. So we're doing a combined program of activity. So we're working with a wide range of existing institutions. We're doing things like PFR, energy retrofit, that includes build quality, as I mentioned earlier. We're running centres as flood hubs, where we're bringing organisations, a range of organisations in together to deal with their sector-specific issues, but in a flooding context. We're increasing access to insurance, in doing street level measures, natural flood risk management, household suds, etc., etc. And the big challenge, of course, of all of this is coordination and synchronizing activity across all of these sectoral boundaries and place boundaries, working at the place of the slowest, the need for windful individuals, and most importantly, in some ways, other sectors don't always see the value to them of incorporating a flood risk aspect, particularly if we're dealing with issues of complexity, procurement, contracts, private public sector collaboration, and so on. Next slide, please. So if we get to the financial resilience challenge, there are three issues that we've pulled out. One is about accessibility, another is affordability, and the third one is appropriateness. So we talked about the 2/3 of properties either not having insurance or don't knowing. We've also discovered through the original research, but also the ongoing activity, that there's a really poor understanding of the value of insurance, especially about younger people. Lots of people say they've got more urgent priorities and may be poor. And that there is a huge assumption that landlords provide insurance. But the big one is that even if people want to buy insurance or can afford to buy insurance, they can't access it. Lots of people can't access it for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. So focusing on accessibility, there are lots of barriers. Typically, if you don't have digital skills for whatever reason, language skills or understanding the value, assumptions about landlords, poverty, technical language in documents, lack of access to computer, lack of knowledge how to use a computer. All of these means that you've got to use an insurance broker. And what we found nationally, what was known nationally, is that there's been a massive loss of insurance brokers across the high street as insurance brokers focus on digital trade, the digital market, and as they're bought out, there's been a huge reduction in the number of independent insurance brokers. And as we don't know for certain, but when we've been talking to Beaver about it, we think that, or it would make sense for insurance brokers to focus their high street presence on those areas where they're going to make the greatest profit, which probably isn't in deprived communities. So if you're walking along the high street in the past, you would have been regularly reminded about insurance because you were passing insurance brokers' shops. And nowadays, that is definitely not the case. So in the two communities that we're looking at, there is now only one general purpose, general policies insurance broker in each one of those communities. Whereas previously, certainly, there was much more than that. And even since the beginning of COVID, you can use OpenStreet, you can use Street View on Google to see that's been a massive decline in the number of insurance brokers. So we've been piloting new approaches to break down the barriers. Next slide, please. So the little diagram on the left shows the traditional relationship between the insurance industry and people, which is direct. Insurance broker, comparison website, online access, or you go to somewhere like Beaver or FloodReady's directory, and you deal directly with the insurance industry in whatever form that is. But if you can't do that, what else can you do? So under the Resilient Roach model, we've come up with this notion of facilitation to enable that contact to be made, either because people don't have the skills and it's helping people to access the market digitally, or because it's directing them through to the right places where people can get advice. Next slide, please. And we have this little model here, which is basically saying the Resilient Roach project is acting as that facilitator. And what we're doing is we're training people on the ground, voluntary organizations, Rochdale Borough Council staff, flood champions, and so on, with enough information and skills to be able to direct people to the place where they can get appropriate advice, to help them fill in the forms, to help them yeah, to help them make life easy, to help them understand what it is that insurance is about and so on. And we've been working with the insurance industry to set this up and trial this and pilot this approach. Next slide, please. All right, should I say, sorry, can we go back one? Okay, so what we've been doing is running training courses. And so far, we've run a number of these and the response has been very, very positive. We haven't got the data yet on the impact of that. Has it made any significant difference? But we are looking to see that in the future, both qualitative and quantitative. One of the responses has been from people like citizens advice bureaus, and housing officers and so on. It's because we can also point them to the areas where we think there's low uptake of insurance and so on. They now have an understanding of where, if they ask a question about insurance, it can help them understand the background and context of other people's problems. It might be debt issues, for example, that people might not be saying, I mean, might not be forthcoming with. We all know that if you are working on an advice line or face-to-face with people, people don't always tell you the full truth, the whole truth. And it can sometimes take several meetings to get through to understanding that whole context and the background. But by asking questions about insurance, it gives them another arm, another way into finding out and being able to address people's concerns. Next slide, please. So this is a social housing context, and we're working with social housing. And the important bit here is that we're working in an integrated way. So when we have our meeting with Rochdale Borough Wide Housing in this instance, we're also talking to them about which of their properties has got PFR fitted, and the importance of actually not drilling holes in the flood door, the need for seals to be investigated and so on, maintenance and so on, and the appropriate training for tenants as they go in. We can also talk to them. We can then also talk to them, the tenants, about and support the housing association. Talk to tenants about social housing insurance as well, and encourage the uptake of that. So rather than going in many times, we can go in once with different arms of the project. We can also talk to the social housing provider about flood risk in the area and the sorts of things that Alan was talking about in terms of recoverability. So when they're doing maintenance programs, they can take those factors into account. Next slide, please. This is the Good Shepherd. No, this is the Toll House. We have a couple. In each community, we are looking to build a flood hub. We have acquired buildings in each area, and these can be used as centres, certainly for bringing in insurance brokers, talking about insurance, but also the full panoply of other issues. We can use it for social housing providers to talk to tenants, prospective tenants. We can use it for all sorts of the major capital schemes going on in the area, so we can use these for those things as well. So because they're both pretty much in the centre of the communities, we can use these as basis for a realistic and ongoing dialogue. Plus, there will be displays, and not this one, but the other one. We're looking at having a sort of household suds measures display as well, as to see just to show what people can do. Next slide, please. We're also actively talking to managing agents, letting agents, and through Rochdale's private sector landlords team through to landlords as well. It's very clear that letting agents and managing agents are not always very clear about their responsibilities or about their role or about their opportunities in things like, for example, encouraging the uptake of PFR or other measures or insurance to actually as being selling points. lots of the landlords in the area are either external landlords, or they're people who bought when houses were cheap on right to buy, and they frankly can't afford to invest in their own properties. So things like PFR maintenance this is the standard models of PFR maintenance don't work. We showed that in the Resilient Roach project. And we've been trialing one or two other methods and approaches. And we do need to actually, when we think about things like Build Back Better, when we think about maintenance contracts, and standardized maintenance contracts and the guidance that's out there, and we also think about things like property FPCs, flood protection certificates. We also need to think about the social justice consequences in communities like this, where actually people can't necessarily afford to do these things. The grants are never going to cover costs. Are they going to drive poverty further and disadvantage further? If the well-off can do this stuff and those who are not well-off can't, what impact is that going to have on our societies? And we need to properly investigate things in order that we design schemes properly. There's nothing wrong with the concept of FPCs or Build Back Better or PFR or whatever, but we must take those social justice issues into account in designing them, because communities like this could well be made even worse off, be further disadvantaged if we don't actually do that properly. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's me. Done.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the presentation, Paul. Really appreciate it. It's great to hear all the work going on in Rochdale to link up all those different sectors involved in flood resilience, energy efficiency, social housing, insurance, etc. So fantastic work happening there. Okay, before we go to the Q&A, we'll hopefully have a few minutes just to look at one or two questions. We'll have a brief presentation from Paul Schaffer, who's going to provide a very quick overview of BeFloodReady. So Paul is Director of Innovation and Delivery at CIWEM and responsible for the BeFloodReady community of practice. He's been involved in the development, delivery and sharing of good practice on water management, including flood resilience, for over 20 years. And just a helpful tip, Paul mentioned to me that there might be a QR code to scan. So if your mobile's handy, that might be helpful. Over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Richard. And also thanks everybody for attending today's webinar. I understand there's been some difficulties with some people signing on. What we will be doing is sending an email out with a link for people later. So if you're in offices with colleagues that have struggled, to let them know that we will circulate the email with the link for the YouTube video as soon as it's ready. So basically, we're a community practice that's wanting to develop a sense of community around those that are interested in delivering or procuring or using PFR with a view to improving the competency and competence and consistency of PFR delivery. So on the website, we're hosting a number of relevant resources for PFR, which we've got about 140 or so resources captured there at the moment that can be searched, and also will be relevant for different elements of PFR in terms of before flood, during a flood and after, and also the recovery process. This is our second webinar. We had a webinar earlier in the year looking at people and PFR, and we also got a number of case studies on the website. And we will start linking to accredited training and events on property flood resilience as we take things forward. And some of you may have also be aware that we've got newsletters and blogs that are coming out, and we're trying to get a blog out at least once every couple of months. The last one we did was kindly provided by Mary, talking about low cost, easy ways to actually improve property flood resilience in the face of a flood warning, because it was at the time that we're having a number of warnings hitting the media. So as Richard said earlier, we've got a number of partners and supporters across the PFR sector, representing government, regulators, insurers, and also those consultants and contractors involved in PFR delivery at the moment. So we can't really be running the community of practice without their support, and also without the support of others like Mary, Flood Mary, and also National Flood Forum, DEFRA, and Alan Ryan's also providing a local authority perspective on things. So there's obvious ways for you to get involved. One is to please use the website, and we'd welcome any feedback. Sign up to the community of practice by waving your camera or QR code scanner at that code. And we're keen to find case studies. So if you've got good practice going in, or if you've got some lessons learned that you're willing to share, please do let us know. We'd love to have some of your case studies. Likewise, if there's news and of generic activities in and around PFR, please do let us know. And if you've got an opinion or some thought leadership, do also offer that through as a blog. And if when you go to our resources page, you spot something we've missed, please just do let us know whether there's some relevant resources out there that we should signpost. And we're always looking for suggestions for the next event or webinar. And I think we're planning one probably for winter, which might be early January, around approaches to PFR delivery, covering Build Back Better, PFR framework, and also the DEFRA recovery grant. So there's a BeFloodReady LinkedIn group as well, if you want to find out more, and also ask some of those people on the forum for questions or queries. That's an approach to see if we can get some dialogue going in and around the community. So other events that CIWEM's involved in, our Welsh branch has a face-to-face conference on climate change and flood risk management in Cardiff on the 20th of November, and our Yorkshire and Humber Flood and Water Quality Conference is happening in Leeds on the 27th of November, and that's been pushed forward by Tyne and Humber Group. So yeah, please do keep an eye out for what's going on with regards to BeFloodReady. Our next event, as I said, is going to be on delivery approaches, and that will be announced on LinkedIn, but also those that have signed up to the BeFloodReady community will also be informed about what's happening. So I think that's pretty much me finished, and I think we're now moving to Q&A, Richard.
Perfect, thanks for that, Paul. I think a lot of the questions that have been put in the Q&A have already been answered, which is great. So if you do open up the Q&A section on Zoom, there's 3 tabs at the top. So there's an open one, there's one which is answered, and we haven't dismissed any questions, so don't worry about that. But yeah, if you want to have a look at the ones that have been answered, then that's great. Just in the interest of time, there's only a couple of minutes left, but I did want to just pick up on something just linked to the theme around innovation. So if all the presenters could ensure the cameras are on from this, because I am coming to you all in a second, just for a quick sort of 20-second answer from each of you. We've seen a lot of innovation over the last, sort of 5 years in particular around property flood resilience. We've obviously got lots of innovation happening at the moment. Just, quick sentence, what more is needed? What else is needed around innovation over the next few years to push us on to that next step where people are really starting to prepare for flooding and make themselves and their properties more resilient? So, right, I'm going to go in order of how you appear on my screen. So, unfortunately, Paul Cobbing, that means you first.
Okay, that's fine. We need to think big, in the sense of, if we're really going to adapt to a change in climate change and increases in flooding, we have to ask some difficult questions. We have to ask some big questions about adaptation. What does that mean for communities, for example, in rapid response areas? It's not just coastal communities. What does it mean in places that regularly flood? It's not just about doing more PFR. We actually have to use cross-sectoral stuff as well, but we have to challenge ourselves about saying, well, hold on, at what point do we actually need to come up with answers about, for example, regeneration. And what happens to those communities if we do regeneration? Because we know from past experience that what happens is poorer communities, people and poorer people and more vulnerable people actually just get excluded from regenerated areas and move to different places. So how do we support them? How do we design processes that will take us through those adaptive processes, which actually support communities along the way and support them in the true sense of the word, both economically, financially, socially, and environmentally, yeah, and over a process of time? And how do we involve them in that process without totally clogging up the system? So there's a whole some really big, chunky things that we need to address.
Perfect. Great answer. Thanks, Paul. Come to you next, Jed.
Oh, it's a good question, Richard. I don't know. I think probably from where I sit, it's moving to I guess, what would you call it? A holistic or integrated form of flood risk management. At the moment, we are siloed off. I really think that's really unhelpful. For it's not just groundwater flooding, surface water flooding is the other really good example. We're kind of getting up to speed with that, aren't we? But the way we've sectioned it all out is just it doesn't work in my view. So that's not really an innovation. But I think the other innovation I would say, so the program that myself, Gail, and Alan will work on, and Paul as well. It's full of quite amazing stuff that's been happening, like, but in little pockets, right? How do we roll this out across the country? So I think the innovation's there. It's then how do we spread it? That's going to be the big thing for me.
It's a good challenge there. Okay, moving on, Martin.
So I agree with Paul that it's about making this bigger, about PFR bigger and expanding. I think that means going to a much bigger group of homes that have a more marginal flood risk. So we're looking mainly at the minute at houses with very high flood risk and quite a significant peril. So possibly more lower level of house risk, maybe lower level of adaptation and response, maybe low depth. And I think that poses three challenges, one of which is technological, about what are the products suitable for that. One of which is about delivery and what's the delivery model and how do we go at scale and therefore reduce cost per house. And the third one is about persuading homeowners whose risk isn't so apparent to accept those adaptations.
Perfect. Great answer there, Martin. Thank you. Alan, turning to you next.
I think something that will probably underpin all of those points is data and evidence. So again, if we need to be looking at new build or housing regs, if we need to look at threshold levels like Martin's talking about, I think we need far better, far more scale of data and evidence. Because again, things like insurers, things like the flood performance certificates, we need the data to underline this. But like Jed pointed out, we've got lots of really innovative pockets of work. It's just collating that together and making sure that we don't lose that legacy that we're building at the moment.
Perfect. Yeah, data and evidence are critical parts of this. Moving on, Gail.
So I think also a bit like Alan, I'd like to kind of take it back a layer and say that when we have the robust data and evidence, there's a real squeamishness on the behalf of RMAs to make that evidence available in all of its glory to the public. So there is a thing around delivering bad news and people going into denial on receipt of that bad news. But I think there's a balance to be struck. And I think at the moment, we're just not messaging clearly enough. We're not saying this is going to happen because we're afraid of reputational damage should it not happen. But I think when there's a robust database and when there's evidence that kind of clearly demonstrates that more and more areas are going to be at risk in the future, we need to really work out our reticence around correct messaging, around getting people on side.
Perfect. Thanks, Gail. And lastly, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's sort of it's probably a combination of what a few people have said. So like Paul said, I think go big in terms of applying it in lots of different contexts. And that also relates to what Martin said about some of those contexts are the cases of low flood depths, etc. So seeing it so that homeowners can actually see across a range of different applications. And then what Alan and Gail have both said about measuring it. measure it, what works and what doesn't work, and start to really be able to see. So it's sort of like widespread piloting and measurements that actually moves to being able to scale in the particular segmentations that we see it really working most effectively in.
Brilliant. Thanks. Great comments there. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks all. So from the presentations, you'll hopefully have a better appreciation of innovation in and around flood resilience. PFR is just one piece in the whole flood resilience jigsaw, but an increasingly important piece, I would say. There've been a number of really great steps forward in recent years with the PFR Code of Practice and training, updated product standards, Pathfinder projects, this community of practice, FCRIP program. But I think what's clear is we can't stand still. The innovative work that's been presented to us today is perhaps the next step on our path to being a nation more aware and resilient to flood risk. So things are continually changing. I hope you appreciate that. We clearly need to do more in support of the different organisations, professions and communities around delivering and piquing their interest in PFR. And as professionals, we need to help to ensure that there's an up-to-date awareness of approaches to become more prepared and resilient to flooding. And in doing so, we also need to evaluate the processes and the products that we can use to improve resilience and start to really embed today's innovation, what we've heard about over the course of the presentations, into tomorrow's practice and business as usual. So all that's left for me to do is to thank the speakers for their presentations, and thank you to you as the audience for your patience and your questions and for listening to all the content today. So I also want to thank the partners and supporters again of BeFloodReady in helping to make this possible today. So many thanks, and I'll close the webinar there.